Now that we've seen what it is we're tracking to, what it is we're looking to build, let's go ahead and start to create our project using Xcode and take a look at the basic project structure that you're going to start with when you're creating this iOS application, or more specifically, this iPhone application. Now, I'm not going to go through all the nitty-gritty details of Xcode and the actual iPhone or iOS platform itself, but I will call out some interesting features here and there just so that you understand them a little bit better, so you're not taken aback when you start to go through and actually play around with this if this is your first adventure into the world of Xcode and iOS development. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to open up Xcode, and you're going to have a number of different options here. So what you can do at this point is you can actually get started with a playground. And if you've never done that, I highly recommend that you go ahead and play around with that. If you go back to my previous course on the Swift programming language, I do a lot of work using the playground. It's a very interesting tool. It's very beneficial to really get started using Swift, especially if you've never done it before. So I would definitely recommend that for sure. You can create a new Xcode project. You can also open up an existing one, and you can also see a list of the previous things that you've done, previous files, and a number of other different things that you can do to get started. So we're going to go ahead and create a new Xcode project. And in this point, we're going to be presented with a number of templates that we can use to create this particular application. Now, really, you can start anywhere. There's really no right or wrong answer here. What I typically do is select the single view application because that's pretty much lean and mean. It's going to give you just the absolute basics to get started and not really overwhelm you with a lot of extra files and configurations and things of that nature. So when I'm first learning how to get in here and use Xcode and create these applications, I start there because, like I said, it's going to give you just enough to get started. But before you check that, make sure that you are under the iOS family of templates here and you have applications selected, and then select single view application. So from this point, you can go ahead and click next, and this is where you're going to start to define the name and the basic characteristics and technologies that you're going to be using for your application. So I'm going to call this Swift Reader, as you saw in the previous lesson when you got to see exactly what it is we're trying to build. And then you can put in a whole bunch of different things here, your organization name, identifier. Now the identifier is kind of interesting, as this is the kind of reverse notation of what you would see as you would put something into, say, your web browser. So it's going to be typically starting with com dot something like a domain name-ish type thing. And then at the bottom, it's going to wind up creating this bundle identifier for you that's actually going to concatenate the identifier and your product name. Now for the language, obviously we're going to select Swift, but you could also continue to use Objective-C. You're not required to use Swift, but that's why we're here. And you can choose your devices, whether you want this to be an iPhone, an iPad, or a universal. But since we're just getting started using Swift to target iOS, we're going to stick with the basics and we're going to stick with iPhone. And in upcoming courses, we'll start to dig into some of the other things as we go. Now, use core data, this checkbox down here. If you've never done any sort of iOS development, or if you've never used core data, don't be intimidated here. Leave this checkbox checked. We are going to use core data a little bit later in this course to show you how to save data that the user is inputting into a local storage medium, which just so happens to be SQLite in this particular implementation in iOS. But this is going to allow us to kind of do database type things, and I'm going to define what I mean by database type things later on in the course, but just leave this box checked because this is going to allow us to do some pretty cool things later on in the course. Then we'll go ahead and click next. And now we're going to be asked where we want to put this, and so I'm just going to leave it in my documents folder for the time being. And you can create a Git repository here if you would like, that's fine. I'll leave it checked for now, and then we'll go ahead and click create. Now this will go through the process of creating the project for me and doing a whole bunch of things like adding configurations, adding files, and a lot of basic stuff like that. So I'm going to open this up a little bit so we can see a little bit better. I'm going to take you through kind of what the project structure is and what we're looking at here. So you're given 3 folders, and if you don't see this view, up above here you have a number of different button options here, make sure you have the one on the far left selected, and this is going to show your project navigator. So you'll see 3 folders here: Swift Reader Tests, and Products. So if you take a look at Swift Reader, we can go ahead and take a look at some of these files that. Now, if you've done iPhone or iOS app development before, this is going to seem extremely familiar to you. And if you haven't, then there's a little bit more to it. So I would definitely urge you to read up a little bit more on developer.apple.com, as I'm not going to go into very deep details on a lot of this stuff, but you'll kind of get the basic ins and outs. Now, the app delegate, this is going to provide a class where you basically, from within your application, kind of have that system level ability to see what's going on with your application with respect to the system. So this also defines what's known as a window, and everything within your iPhone application in this instance is going to run within a single instance of a window. So the app delegate's job here is to create that window and have it available to you so that you can put some information into it. And as you can see here, we have basically some methods, or almost events, if you will. We have did finish launching, we have will resign active, did enter background. So there's a lot of system level type events that you can start to work with here when you're creating your application. We're not going to do a whole lot in here as far as these are concerned, but a little bit later we're going to talk about this core data, which is kind of nice that it's all set up for you here by default, so there's not really a whole lot of stuff you have to worry about as far as core data is concerned. A lot of it's already set up for us. View controller is the out-of-the-box view controller that's going to be given to you via a storyboard, which you're going to see right here. We have main.storyboard. Now, storyboards are really a graphical way to lay out your application as far as the transitions between screens and what type of segues and transitions happen when you click on a button or do some sort of gesture or something like that. This allows you to lay it all out very visually, which is what we're going to do and take advantage of in this course. And so we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in the next couple of lessons, but just know that a storyboard is a way for you to graphically lay out your application, at least from a UI perspective, so you can see the flow of information and the flow of the user from one screen to the next. Now, the previous viewcontroller.swift file is actually a default file that's given to you to represent the code behind this default screen we're given here. And we're actually going to blow this away later on because we're going to not use it. We're actually going to start with a different type of view controller, but we'll get to that. Then we have images.xc assets, which is a relatively new mechanism that was introduced into Xcode to allow you to easily manage the assets or the images and icons within your application, so you can work with a lot of different images and icons in here. And right now, by default, you're only given one, which is the app icon, which will be the default icon that's presented on the springboard of your iOS or your iPhone device. And you have, as you see, a couple different options here to support different resolutions and different screen sizes for different versions of iOS. As you can see here, iOS 5 and 6, 5 through 8, 7 and 8, and all sorts of different versions like that. So that's something we're not going to use a whole lot of because we're not really overly concerned about the icon as far as this is concerned. We'll probably throw something in there later, but it's going to be very simple so that we can just kind of see how it interacts with the actual system itself. Then we have this launch screen that's been put in here for us. Now, you'll see when we run our application that we're actually going to see this by default pop up as kind of like our loading screen. And you may remember in previous versions of Xcode, or maybe when you were doing some other development, you would see like a default file in here, a default.png, and that would typically be loaded as your launch screen. Well, it's changed just a little bit here, but it's the same basic concept, and you can kind of play around with this and add different text on here, or put some graphics on here or whatever. But this is basically going to be your launch screen when you're creating this application or when you start to deploy it to either the simulator or an actual device. Now, the XC data model right here, this is what we're going to use to interact with or design our data model when it comes to using core data and that database kind of functionality. And we can start to build those objects out here. And we're going to go into this in much more detail later on in the course, but just know that it's there. And this was created for us because we checked that use core data box. And then down at the bottom here, we have supporting files folder. Right now, all we have in here is our info.plist, and this is the ever important kind of name value pair type file that's going to define a lot of properties, which are basically kind of configuration type settings and information about your application, as far as what levels of the what levels of iOS you're going to support, and a number of different things like that. Now, this is a very important file. It needs to be there. If it's not there, you're going to have some building issues, as well as some deployment to Apple issues if you choose to actually go that far. So just know that it's there, and it's kind of used to create your application and define some high-level properties about it. Now, the second folder here is Swift Reader Tests, which was created for us by default. We're not going to do too much as far as creating tests, but this is where you can actually start to create some unit tests. And this was a nice feature that was kind of added into Xcode, and the ability to create unit tests out of the box instead of having to actually install third-party frameworks or something like that to actually start to write unit tests against your code, because that's a very important task that most of us feel is something we have to address as software engineers. But just know that this is here as well, and this also has an info.plist specific to the Swift Reader test project in and of itself. And then finally, we have the products folder, which is what's ultimately going to be built when we go through the process of building this application. It's going to create a swiftreader.app file, which is ultimately what we're going to be using to deploy to our simulator so that we can start to see our application on either a device or the simulator. So we're not too worried about that either. We're going to spend about 95 or 98% of our time in this Swift Reader folder, adding and removing information from this particular folder. So that's the basics of the project structure. And in the next couple of lessons, we're going to start to work on the storyboard and actually start to flush out what this particular application is going to look like, at least from a UI perspective.